I have the delightful honor to introduce to you Professor Shannon Vallor, who holds the Bailey Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh, where she is also appointed in philosophy. Professor Vallor became internationally famous with her outstanding monograph, Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to futures worth living, where she argues from an intercultural point of view for a technomoral virtue, ethics of global scope. We need new focus on moral virtues to guide us in shaping emerging technologies such as social robotics. Professor Vallor explores how technology changes our moral and intellectual habits, our skills and virtues, in short, our character, working far outside the ivory tower and even with the devil, as some of you may say, doing field research as AI ethicist at Google and advising AI industry and education on ethical design. Professor Vallor calls for human-centered AI and automation, that is, the use of these technologies in direct and full support of our own moral and intellectual perfectibility. Her lecture today will illuminate critical and analytical steps that are required before we can shape these technologies to support human wisdom and other virtues. So thank you very much for being here with us today, and we are looking very much forward to your lecture. But before I give the words to Shannon, I would just remind the attendees of you're more than welcome to use the chat functionality. As soon as Professor Vallor has concluded her presentation, we will put in a line in the chat, and from there we will then take the questions, so you can put them in there. So with that said, I will give the word to Shannon Vallor. I just have to unmute her. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Johanna and Marco for inviting me, and to the amazing talks and speakers that I've had the opportunity to see so far yesterday and today. So I wanted to, first of all, prepare the audience that my talk today is a little bit different in its focus from some of the work that I've done before, which is really explicitly talking about the kinds of virtues that we need to cultivate. And my talk today is really taking a step back from that, as the introduction indicated, and really thinking about what are the broader critical moments of reflection that are needed before we can even successfully do the work of ethical or virtuous design and development of social robots. And the argument that I'm going to be making in my talk today is that there is a reckoning, if you will, that has been delayed and deferred, certainly not only in social robotics, but broadly in our culture of socio-technical design and development, but certainly a reckoning that needs to happen in social robotics as well. And I'm looking forward to the conversation about that. And interestingly, I think there have been in the first two plenaries some notes that my talk will echo. So perhaps that indicates that there are some convergent concerns here that those of us who've been working in this field for some time are seeing together as a need for the field to address. So let me, this is the moment where we pray that our slides actually work. So let's all cross our fingers together. Okay, hopefully this is working for everyone, and someone will interrupt me if my slides aren't displaying properly. It can be quite difficult to tell. I'm going to also warn you that my slides are a little more text heavy than I normally would do for a plenary session. I think my sensitivity to the fact that the Robophilosophy community has always been a strongly international community, and lots of people whose first languages are not English. I think sometimes it's helpful just to have words on the screen to help track. But if that's irritating to you, please feel free to just look away from the slides and listen to my voice, and you'll get essentially the same experience. So the outline of my talk, as I commented on Twitter over the weekend, interestingly ended up echoing a lot of song titles from the band REM. By the time I got to Reckoning and thinking about Fables of the Reconstruction, I decided might as well go all the way here with a theme. But that's just an odd coincidence. And for those of you who aren't familiar with 80s American indie pop, this will be completely obscure. But the structure of the talk is really starting from the standpoint of looking at where we are, where we've been, and the aspects of the field that have matured a little bit in helping us steer between some of the early, more kind of shallow approaches to robot ethics that were necessary but insufficient in their sophistication and depth, and a different kind of shallow approach that was popular for some time and still peeks its head up periodically, the kind of obsession with the robo-apocalypse or narratives that frame social robots as somehow providing a conclusion to the human story, rather than a factor in our ongoing development as a human community. The second part of the talk is going to develop a concept called moral debt, which I liken to a familiar concept in software development known as technical debt. And that will show us a little bit about what that reckoning that I spoke of is, that has yet to be confronted and taken on in the field, and what the costs of delaying that reckoning are. I'm going to talk also a little bit in the third section about the kinds of risks that are associated with trying to take a path forward with socio-technical development that is ahistorical, that does not reckon with the past properly. And my argument is that we can learn from past efforts in other cultural contexts. I'm going to use the American Reconstruction period as an allegory. We can learn from some of these other historical trajectories that moving forward requires us to carry the past with us, and take on that reckoning rather than presume that we can move forward with a clean slate and with only our present actions and hopes and values in play. And then finally, thinking about the future of a remedial and reconstructive turn in social robotics, something which carries that past forward in a way that liberates us from, over time, liberates us from its harms and its injustices, and allows us to think more freely about the kinds of futures with social robots that we might enjoy. Okay, so let's jump in. When I talk about the shallows of robot ethics, I'm talking about some of the trends that for some time were really dominant in the field. We, for a long time, in the sub-community of robot ethics, which of course does not comprise the totality of social robotics or or even the totality of technology ethics. But nevertheless, those of us who've been working on the ethical implications of robots and social robots in particular have focused a lot on, in its early years, on direct harms to individuals caused by robots themselves, whether those would be physical harms, such as injury, or whether those might be other kinds of moral harms like deception, manipulation. And not to say that these aren't important considerations, but what I'm arguing is that the field of robot ethics has grown to take a more expansive view, and that's a healthy thing. Because there's a lot more going on in the ethics of social robots than just individual harms that individual artifacts can cause. Sorry, I have a, there we go. Another piece of that is the tendency to target only the most obvious and easily avoidable harms. So I think for a while the field was really picking the low-hanging fruit, so we say, and I think that that's not a bad thing. But I think we now have to move beyond some of the more obvious and easily avoidable harms, such as robots that that lie to us, that robots that that somehow violate their designers' wishes and cause harm or injury to people. And I think we need to broaden out from there and look at some more subtle and structural kinds of harms that are also harder to avoid in robot design and development. We also spent many years talking about proposals to embed values into social robot design. And yet I think that framing turned out to be quite inadequate because it presupposes that there aren't already values built into our robots, that there aren't already values built into the techniques and the methods and the approaches that underpin robotics and social robotics as a field. So I think a more mature view and a deeper view is that the values have always already been there. And it is not about bringing values into a neutral space, but grappling with the values that are already inscribed in the work that we do. A lot of our early approaches to robot ethics, and again, there are many exceptions so I certainly don't want to paint us all with a broad brush here, but I think a lot of our approaches were power agnostic, and that was a shortcoming in many of the initial analyses of the ethical implications of social robots. By power agnostic, I mean we paid insufficient attention early on to the differences in position and the differences in distributions of power and opportunity and agency in society that affect how robots are designed, developed, and used. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And a lot of the remedies that we talked about were limited to ethical risk mitigation, or ethical risk assessment and mitigation. So you have a design, you have a use case, you have a context, those are givens. And then you assess what the ethical risks are of using this robot with this population in this environment in this way. And then you figure out what the worst harms might be or the most likely harms might be, and then you figure out how to mitigate those. Obviously that's better than doing nothing, but I'm arguing that it is ultimately a shallow and inadequate approach to robot ethics, and one that we need to expand beyond. And then finally, I think a lot of the work that was done in the field, including my own, was often anchored in an ahistorical present, thinking about social robotics as something new, something fresh, something that was being developed from a more or less blank slate, and then thinking about how to do that right and in a way that's responsible. But I think we did not sufficiently foreground the ways in which the field is not new, and carries forward a historical legacy that shapes the choices that we make, that shapes the alternatives that we explore. So now pivoting to the other extreme, if you will, or the other kind of shallowness, it's the narrative of robots as, if you will, robots as eschatology, robots as the story of how human history ends. If you will, it's the machina ex machina of the apocalypse. And we've all seen films and read science fiction novels and heard narratives from people like Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking that carry forward this shallow approach to the robot story, where the robot is really simply a device that allows us to tell the end of the human story, whether that's by robotic elimination of humans, some sort of merger with machines that allows us to transcend our humanity. But here the robots become just a way of talking about where humans end up. And these are primarily universalizing narratives that I think foreclose the proliferation and divergence of many human robot stories. And when we talk about culturally sustainable robotics, I think one of the things that we know we must mean is that there is no one story of human-robot relations to be told even in the future, and that there will be many stories that will proliferate and should proliferate, and that we must be open to a divergence of these stories rather than a convergence in a universalizing narrative. At least that possibility needs to remain open for us. The tendency to think about robots as an endpoint also projects that endpoint from the status quo taken as a given. So we don't question where we are with robots, we just think about where they're taking us. So we have that sort of technological determinism in our minds that allows us to think about this story as one that is a line drawn between 2 points, the now, which is taken as a given, and the end, which often is also presented as a given. So this is an ahistorical approach, just as the approaches that I was speaking of earlier. It skips over all possible futures to some inevitable and singular end. And I think we are fortunately, as a community, generally moving past these kinds of shallow narratives. So the signs of maturity that I see in robot ethics are a growing focus on historical, cultural, and structural contexts, the ability to consider harms beyond the individual, and even harms beyond those that might befall the human species, thinking about harms to groups, to communities, to institutions, to systems, to varied forms of life. I think the field is increasingly no longer power agnostic. We see differential profiles of harm and risk, differential profiles of benefit and opportunity for different constituents and communities. And I think we are moving as a field here in robot ethics beyond mere mitigation of ethical risk to deeper kinds of reform. And increasingly, I think the field is open to a plurality of sustainable futures, not one overarching best narrative of human-robot relations. So these are the good things. For those of you that are looking for some light in the darkness of our present year of 2020, grab mentally an image of this slide, because this is the good part. This is the optimistic part of my talk. And what follows, I think, delves into some things that are a little more troubling for our future and a little more challenging to grapple with. But I think we ought to recognize the progress that we've made as a field, and that many of the shallow beginnings have already begun to deepen into something more robust and mature. But there's still much more to do, much deeper to go, in order to reckon with the moral debt that we have inherited and also created within the context of robotics and socio-technical development in general, especially in the 21st century. So let's talk about reckoning with that moral debt, which is linked in many ways with history and with the past. So we have to remember that ethics always has a past and not just a present, and that whenever we consider our obligations in the present without looking at the moral ledger that we've inherited, we are acting from a blameworthy ignorance of what we already owe. So the problem with doing robot ethics ahistorically is it imagines that your ledger is balanced, that you're in the black, and that it's just a question of not creating harms anew. But we have to ask what moral debt is still on the ledger of social robotics, and moreover, what interest does that debt accrue? So I'm going to talk about this in greater depth now. So I'm drawing a parallel with technical debt in software. This is a concept that dates back to, as far as I can tell, the early 1990s. And in the context of software development, technical debt is something that happens when the labor that's needed to make a socio-technical artifact or system, and in this case, a software package or product, when the labor needed to make that sustainable is deferred in order to make that artifact or product minimally viable and deliverable. And I think this description fits moral debt as well as technical debt. And these two things are related in the context of technology development in ways that I'll talk about. So like technical debt, moral debt in socio-technical systems accrues interest. And what we mean by that is that the cost of fixing the problems to prevent an unrecoverable system failure tends to compound over time. So the more debt we take on in the beginning, the more we end up owing later, the more work we have to do to stave off some kind of calamity or failure. So we always have to take on some technical debt when we design software, but the question is how much debt is safe and reasonable and responsible to take on. If we take on too much debt, whether we're talking about technical debt or moral debt in the context of socio-technical systems development, then we end up with a system that is a net cost to the customer, to the end user, to society. So it's not ultimately beneficial because it cost more to fix than the value that it delivered. And or you end up with a system that's just not sustainable. It has to be junked and replaced with something else. So this is the origin of the concept of technical debt, as far as I can tell, from Ward Cunningham in 1992, who wrote that shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development as long as it is paid back promptly with a rewrite. The danger occurs when the debt is not repaid. So for example, if you ship code that is so poorly constructed, poorly documented, poorly tested, and so forth, that it ends up, really causing a destructive impact on the relationship with your organization's biggest customer, for example. The entire engineering organization can be brought to a standstill. So the problem is that this debt can become a fatal flaw in a software organization. And I'm arguing that the same is true more broadly of socio-technical systems, that the more technical debt, but more importantly, moral debt that we take on, the greater risk we have of a systemic failure, not only of the artifact or the technical system, but the social institutions and systems that it has been intertwined with that may have become dependent on it. So technology contributes to moral debt in two ways. First, when the artifact's design, development, and use itself produces new moral costs, risks, and externalities. So for example, think about social media as a parallel case, not involved with robotics, but we could certainly think of many cases in robotics too. But think about something like Facebook. Facebook's design, development, and use has produced new moral costs and risks imposed upon society as externalities. That's because the development of Facebook did not adequately reckon with the moral debt that was being created by the technical work that was being done to move fast and break things, right? So the move fast and break things ethos in socio-technical systems development tends to produce moral debt of its own by generating these novel costs and risks to society that have not been compensated for or managed. But technology also contributes to moral debt in another way, and that's when societies over-rely on artifacts as temporary patches for these deep structural problems. And we've been talking about, the danger of techno fixes for a while, going back to Evgeny Morozov and others who noticed this technocratic tendency to look at these kinds of deep structural problems in society and say, I have an app for that. And fortunately, we're much more skeptical of these kinds of approaches than we were 10 years ago, because we've seen them fail so catastrophically. But at the same time, we're still doing it. I'll reference this later, but if you look at what happened recently in the UK with the algorithm used to address the challenge of university placements and testing with A levels, in the wake of COVID, you had a complex social problem created by the pandemic here, that there was an attempt to bridge or patch with an algorithmic fix, and the result was a fairly catastrophic failure, as we've seen. But in general, we could find lots of examples, right, of trying to develop technologies, algorithms, apps, robots, whatever, to cover up for or patch over or bridge over some of these structural problems in society that we aren't doing the moral labor to fix. And so the way that technology is contributing to moral debt in this case is by allowing us to further put off repairs to the moral fabric of society or the political fabric that are desperately needed. So in robotics, this plays out in many different ways. So we can think about taking on known moral risks and harms, such as poor security or privacy protections, or deceptive or harmfully stereotyped robot design that we do to accelerate the timeline and lower development costs. So this is an example of that first kind of moral debt I was talking about, where it's the choices we're making as we design and develop a particular robot or application that create new moral debts, where we're basically saying, well, we have to move fast and we have to deliver a working prototype and product, and we can't afford the kinds of security and privacy protections or the kinds of transparency or the kinds of attention to issues of fairness and justice that we would ideally like to put into this system. So we're just going to push out those responsibilities to some later date. And so that involves deferring robust but resource-intensive ethical design practices. So if we think about participatory design and community-led design, those can often identify early on some of the risks of harm that we might otherwise be inclined to overlook or undercount. And yet participatory and community-led design are time-intensive and resource-intensive efforts that themselves are challenging to do well. And so it's tempting to be able to say, well, we just can't take on something like that. So that would be nice, that would be great. But instead, we're just going to cut some corners and do a very quick kind of down and dirty ethical assessment where we'll pick off the low-hanging fruit, try to fix some of those more glaring issues and leave the other stuff and just hope it doesn't cause us too much trouble. Related to that is, deferring and neglecting testing for real-world ethical impact. So we know very well that some of the ethical harms or contributions to social injustice that robots and other artifacts contribute to aren't evident until deployment in the wild, in a real world situation. And yet it's costly and time intensive to test in that environment adequately before we deploy. And so often that testing is minimized or deferred. We often also create moral debt in robotics by passing on remedial duties, by which I mean the duties to remedy some of these moral risks or harms or debts. We pass on those duties to regulators. We say, well, we'll let the lawmakers and the policymakers worry about this, knowing full well that in many contexts, especially in the United States, for example, those regulators have already been captured by industrial interests or by government interests that run counter to the ethical aims that we have to remedy these harms. So it's a sort of sleight of hand where we expect a regulatory system that we know isn't actually functional to take on our responsibilities. There's also a moral debt that's inherited not from our own design and development choices, but just from the social and historical context that we occupy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then I've already spoken about the ways in which we can design robots that actually hide and patch society's moral debts in ways that delay remedial attention to them. When I talk about inherited moral debt, that concept might be a little bit unclear, so let me just go into it a bit. Think about the fact that I spoke earlier about the fact that values are always already embedded in our socio-technical systems. It's not just a matter of us choosing the values that get put there. And very few values are unconditionally good or unconditionally just. So the fact that we have a lot of values baked into our systems doesn't mean they're necessarily better. So think about the values that are already valorized, already baked into social robotics by its particular history and context. And then I think we need to ask the question, what is the moral valence of these values? So some of them that I think are quite obvious, the value of control of agency, domestication of agency, and even domination of agency. And the logics of control and domestication and domination, I think, were already articulated quite well by earlier speakers in this conference, including Selma Sabanovic and Rob Sparrow this morning. So I won't go into great detail about this. Hopefully this is relatively uncontroversial in its reality. And more than just control of agency, on the robot side, we valorize obedient and subservient agency. The idea that it is good for a robot to obey. It is good for a robot to behave in a subservient and submissive manner. We also valorize readability and predictability of agency. We want to be able to know what's going on in our robots. We want to be able to understand their predilections and actions, and we want to be able to predict what they will do. We also valorize replicability and replaceability of agency. We want not just a singular robot, but we want to be able to make many of that type that will perform in exactly the same way and fill exactly the same roles. We think about, for example, the legacy in military robotics of thinking of robots as a force multiplier, right? It's a multiplier of the agency of a warfighter. Also, we valorize plasticity and reconfigurability of agency, the idea that we can remake or redesign a robot to fit a given use case or application. In particular, the software side is more plastic than the hardware side. But in general, we valorize in social robotics this idea of being able to remold agency to our will. And then the disposability of agency, the idea that, for example, we want to create agents that we don't have to feel conflicted about getting rid of if we need to, that we can sacrifice these agents. We want agents that we can sacrifice without cost or without guilt. And obviously there are, some reasonable justifications for some of these values in particular contexts. So for example, I very much want, if I have a robot that's going to go into a radioactive environment where there's been a leak or a spill, I very much prefer the disposability of that robot's agency to sacrificing or disposing of a human agent that has to go in and sacrifice his or her life in order to save the surrounding town from contamination. So I'm not suggesting that these values are inherently unethical, but it's of course easy for us to look at this list and immediately come up with many contexts in which these values are problematic. These values amplify existing structures of injustice in our communities, and allow for forms of exploitation to be exploitation and harm to be perpetuated. I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. The debt ledger in social robotics includes a lot of things, again, some of which have been touched on by earlier speakers. We have in 2020 the fact that most image searches for robot or social robot still yield images that are overwhelmingly white. Also stereotypically feminine, pet-like, or childlike. So reinforcing that notion that robots allow us to reproduce our tendency to value obedient and subservient forms of agency. Much core robotics functionality, this is something that Selma Savanovic mentioned in her opening plenary, has been developed for earlier industrial and military purposes, which constrains the possibility space for social robot design in many unexamined ways. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And finally, as was discussed extensively already in many sessions, I think, successful adoption of social robots can require that robot mirror or reinforce traditional social hierarchies of race, gender, and class, which are themselves inherently unjust or harmful. Moving on, we also need to talk about the fact that social robot impact, both economic and environmental, is currently projected to most heavily disadvantaged, minoritized communities in the global South. And yet, it remains true that communities of design, development, and even the critique of social robots, so even this community that I am a part of as a robot ethicist, we are almost exclusively confined to privileged groups in the global North. So that seems like a moral debt, a problem that we've inherited. And it remains true that the last mile of robotic automation that is often covered by exploitation of cheap human labor. So think of Gray and Suri's great work published last year, Ghost Work, exploring this in a variety of ways. This work often is being done in the global South. So a prime example here is UC Berkeley's KiwiBot food delivery robots that it turned out were being steered and guided by networks of human laborers in Colombia working for $2 an hour, which in Colombia is actually not a bad wage, and yet it raises these issues of exploitation and reinforcement of networks of exploitation and global inequality that social robotics is implicated in. We also know, of course, that social robot performance is increasingly dependent on advances in AI and machine learning that themselves encode and reproduce unjust bias. This has been amply demonstrated and documented by works done by a variety of great scholars. I'll just mention two obvious ones here that hopefully everyone has read or has on their bookshelf to read. Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, many other great works that you can discover on this topic. But think about, in particular in social robotics, the importance of affective design and sentiment analysis as a form of machine learning. And yet we know that these techniques are not only scientifically questionable, but also carry forward many unfair and unjust racial and gender biases in how we understand and police emotion and emotional expression in society. We also have a heavy dependence on investment in in AI and machine learning and robotics that favors techniques of surveillance, categorization, prediction, and control of human behavior and agency. These are the techniques that it's easiest to sell. These are the applications that it's easiest to get people to drop a large pile of VC capital on. And that's a debt that we have on our ledger. And then we also have to recognize that the benchmarks and criteria that we're using for intelligence, competence, et cetera, themselves import sedimented layers of historical and cultural bias in these metrics and concepts. Quantified notions of intelligence and competence have long histories of entanglement with attempts to lend credence to scientific racism and eugenics. And so we have often not examined the way in which our own criteria and benchmarks carry forward those debts. We also use robots heavily as these moral debt patches to perform minimal care for the elderly in contexts where quality human care is possible, but under-resourced, devalorized, and socially neglected. We're using sex robots to supposedly redirect, occupy, and pacify violent sexual impulses towards women and children. So we're not actually removing those impulses, we're simply giving them supposedly an outlet that is less damaging. We're using robots to bridge childcare gaps in areas where, in communities where there's inadequate family care or leave policies. We're seeing robots designed for riot or crowd control in communities where democratic norms are leading to needs for protest and organization of resistance. And we're using robots to clean up hazardous environmental materials and spills in a context where there's very little economic disincentive to produce those environmental hazards. And so the robots are just kind of, if you will, disguising the harms that we're allowing to be perpetuated by our regulatory environment. So I want to kind of draw this section to a close by reading from an open letter from Black in Computing and our allies that was published in June, reminding us that as scientists, technologists, and engineers, we're told often that there's no need for culture in our field. Ones and zeros, the scientific method, and meritocracy form the basis of our discipline, where computing is a neutral entity. And I think the field of robotics has inherited some of this. But as the letter goes on to say, we know this is not true. We know that our field does not exist in a vacuum. We see AI and big data being used to target the historically disadvantaged. We see machine learning systems that routinely identify Black people as animals and criminals. And algorithms we develop are used by others to further intergenerational inequality. And I think this statement can be reflected upon by those who work in social robotics. And I think we need to confront the ways in which our work is used to further intergenerational inequality and injustice. So all of these realities I'm describing reflect moral debts with which social robotics has not reckoned, much less paid. So what are the consequences of that? So I want to talk about moving forward, and there's two ways to try to move forward. One is to move forward without the past, leaving it behind, and one is moving it forward with the past. I want to suggest that only the latter is a viable strategy. As Faulkner says in Requiem for a Nun, the past is never dead. It's not even past. It lives with us, it shapes the present always. For those fans of the film Magnolia, there's a moment where a character actually references this by saying, we may be through with the past, but the past isn't through with us. So there's no free lunch, the debts have to be paid somewhere. And my argument is that the 21st century will be a story of deferred moral debts coming due, environmental debts, political debts, and heavy socio-technical debts. And these will directly impact the sustainability of social robotics. My argument is that social robotics will only be sustainable if designed with the future in mind, but I don't mean a future projected from an illusion of present solvency. Our slate is not blank. We have debts on the ledger. So how do we design social robots for a future that's burdened with this legacy of moral debt? I want to have a cautionary tale here from American history. So for those of you who are not familiar with this particular period of American history, the Reconstruction was a period in the late 19th century that aimed to rebuild a nation that had been devastated by civil war while remedying the racial injustices of the legacy of slavery. But historians largely judge the Reconstruction period to be a failure. And there are lots of different arguments about why it failed. But in general, we can say that the relegitimation of white supremacist practices, known as Jim Crow practices and Jim Crow laws in the 20th century, ensured that the moral debts of the war actually carried forward, and they did so with interest. So the Reconstruction failed. It didn't pay down the debt ledger of slavery. And I would argue that American democracy is collapsing today, largely due to its long unpaid moral debts, and many of which are those debts that trace back to the era of chattel slavery. And we have to think about the fact that the social policies that have failed were in most cases past blind and debt blind, either consciously or unconsciously. And those kinds of social policies, I argue, have accelerated the collapse of American democracy. We did not reckon with the history of racial and economic injustice in America. We pretended that we were past it. We pretended that the debts had been paid, despite the fact that the communities that were still most deeply affected by those harms could show and did tell us quite plainly, those of us in majority and privileged communities in America, that those debts were still most certainly on the ledger. So I want this to be a cautionary tale about how large systems that are framed around noble ideals can fail catastrophically as a result of believing that we can move forward into the future without reckoning with our past. And I think socio-technical systems around the world are highly vulnerable to failure due to this kind of debt blindness. Just thinking about the UK A-levels, I think one of the reasons for that failure is inattention to the legacies of injustice in the English educational system that people were still actively sensitive to and rightly expecting to be addressed. And the fact that the algorithm did not address those or take those on board appropriately, that it in fact perpetuated those injustices, is largely why that algorithm is a failure. So I'm arguing then that the only sustainable 21st century socio-technical systems are going to be remedial and reconstructive technologies. So I'm asking this question: what would a remedial social robotics look like? And how can socio-technical futures be sustained by attending more fully to the past? So this is the final section of my talk, which I'll try to wrap up in about 5 minutes. It's just asking some questions about what remedial and reconstructive social robotics might look like. So remedial robots would be robots designed not to extend, hide, or patch over moral debt, but to aid us in paying it down or even treating its source. Not all of these are obviously unproblematic examples, but just some things that come to mind. Thinking about robots that remove landmines or restore coral. Robots that track and report abuses of power or human rights. Robots that could quickly repair neglected buildings and utilities and infrastructure, especially in underserved communities, whether rural or urban. Robot designs that enlarge our culturally embedded notions of beauty, agency, power, otherness, and so forth. We had a conversation this morning with Rob Sparrow about why do robots need to be white? But also it seems like making robots black is not, or brown is not inherently an unproblematic solution either. So we need to be more creative about robot designs. Perhaps they need to avoid any kind of humanoid appearance, as we've said. But I think we need to think more creatively and ambitiously about designs that would enlarge our notions of value and beauty and agency. We could also think about reconstructive robots. Robots designed not just to pay down some of the debts of the past, but to enable futures in which we do not create debt in the same ways, more just socio-technical futures. So we could think about robots that instead of replacing human caregivers or compensating for our lack of investment in human care, we could use robots to invest more in human care, to assist and support human caregivers. And many of us who work on CareBots have talked about that for many years, so that's not a new insight, but it's something I think we certainly can put in this category. We can also talk about robots that supply affordable and needed accommodations for disabled people, accommodations that are actually welcome and asked for, as opposed to designed without the participation and voice of those who would supposedly benefit from them. We can think about robots that perform labor in environments that simply cannot be made safe for humans, environments in which humans still labor today. We can think about robots, and this is more technically ambitious and may not be possible, but robots that are effective in de-escalating or mediating conflict. And robots that maintain physical systems and items so that they need not be disposed of so consistently, so that we can in fact provide more environmentally sustainable models of physical systems. The hard problems for this project, I think, would require new streams of investment for long-term public interest applications. But the fact is that current investment model for social robotics isn't working that great anyway. Jennifer Robertson has written on this, I think, about the fact that our current investment models are still beholden to military and industrial purposes that may not be sustainable. And we haven't seen that, we haven't seen great success in commercial social robots. So I think we have an opportunity here to pivot and think about new models of investment. We also need to reckon with the fact that this might narrow the scope for new ventures. So can the field of social robotics focus on fewer paths, fewer projects, but more sustainable ones that have a true remedial and reconstructive merit? We have to reckon with the fact that culturally sustainable robot design will be more technically challenging. So again, it will cost more, it will take longer, and it will require more technical and moral intelligence to develop. But I think all of those things are obstacles that we can and should confront. And it demands an ongoing critical reassessment of the field. Why do we want to keep building social robots? What are they for? To what sustainable ends are we doing this work, and for what sustainable communities? I think there are also promising paths forward that we can build upon, and this is my final slide. We can take inspiration from ongoing efforts of decolonization of various research fields. For example, anthropology and philosophy as disciplines have a growing interest in decolonizing those disciplines. So what does a decolonized social robotics look like? And I think there's been an interesting research paper published recently by DeepMind on decolonizing AI. So if AI can be decolonized, certainly social robots could be as well. We could also align with other efforts to build more culturally sustainable forms of socio-technical activity. So Russell and Vinsel in 2018 published a lot of interesting work on the turn from innovation to maintenance as an ideal. So could we think about the sustainable goals of maintenance of society, of infrastructure, and how social robots could contribute to that? Also, given that science fiction has long shaped the robot imaginary, I think we need to ask, can social robotics follow the lead of today's science fiction, which is now enjoying a creative renaissance driven by many more diverse voices and visions of the future than in the era of Asimov and Heinlein and so forth. So I think we have a moment for revitalization of social robotics that can perhaps derive artistic and creative inspiration from the revitalization of science fiction in a more culturally sustainable vein. And I think we need to bring the creative arts further into social robot design. This is something that many have called for before, but I think we need to, as I said, develop new notions of beauty in robots, new notions of power and agency and otherness, and not be locked into using the same materials and the same designs that have been endlessly iterated on that carry forward many of these unsustainable moral debts. So I think we finally can, sorry, I have to move something out here. I think we need to strengthen our norms of participatory design. We need to build communities of social robot design and development that are not concentrated in the global north, that engage the stakeholders who will be most directly impacted by the designs that we develop. And we need to enlarge the moral community of technologists and roboticists and social scientists more broadly, and ethicists too. So that's the end of my talk, and I look forward to talking about these ideas further with you. Thanks.